2 years ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing today's guest. At the time, she had recently been appointed Assistant Dean of Admissions at a brand new medical school and was working on setting up an admissions process for its first class. Since then, the Kaiser Permanente School of Medicine has enrolled one class and is working now on its second class. Amazingly, for such a new program, it is ranked third on Accepted Selectivity Index. Let's check in with Dr. Lindia Willies-Jacobo to learn how the Kaiser Permanente Medical School has managed the last 2 tumultuous years.
Welcome to Admission Straight Talk, the podcast dedicated to graduate admissions and helping you approach the application process thoughtfully and successfully. Your host is Accepted's founder and world-renowned admissions guru, Linda Abraham. At Accepted, our mission is to get you to that unforgettable moment when you read your acceptance email and shout, "Yes, I'm in!" Confident you'll be attending the perfect program to help you launch the career of your dreams.
Welcome to the 424th episode of Admission Straight Talk. Thanks for joining us. Before we meet our guest today, I want to invite you all to Accepted's next med school admissions webinar, How to Create Successful Secondary Applications. It's a free webinar, which I will present on July 8th, 2021. Secondary applications will flood your calendar and consciousness in the weeks ahead. You have to turn them around quickly and effectively. But how? Have no fear. We've got you covered. Register for How to Create Successful Secondary Applications for free at accept.com/424webinar. Our guest today is Dr. Lindia Willies-Jacobo, Senior Associate Dean for Admissions and Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity at the Kaiser Permanente Bernard J. Tyson School of Medicine, which welcomed its first class in the summer of 2020 and in the midst of the pandemic. While the Kaiser Permanente School of Medicine may be new, Dr. Willies-Jacobo is not at all new to the field of med school admissions. She earned her MD at UCSD and served there as a professor of pediatrics from 1992 to 2019. For 22 of those years, she was also the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Community Partnerships and Director of the Program in Medical Education, Health, Equity. Hello, Dr. Willies-Jacobo. Welcome to Admissions Straight Talk.
Hello, Linda. It's so good to be here with you again. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Okay, can you give us an overview of the Kaiser Medical School curriculum, focusing on its more distinctive elements?
Absolutely happy to do that. And to your point, we just welcomed our inaugural class a year ago, last July, in the midst of a pandemic. We certainly did not anticipate that. But I think in terms of some unique features of the school, I think perhaps the most distinct one would be that we are a non-lecture based school. So we perhaps are, if not one of the only ones, the only school whereby all of our learning takes place in small groups of 8 because we welcomed 50 students. There is one group of 10 students. And so it is non-lecture based, problem-based learning. It's all integrated. As you know, many of our students prospective students may have read, we've decided not to go with sort of typical departments as there are at many schools, but instead we do have 3 pillars: our Department of Biomedical Science, our Department of Clinical Science, and our Department of Health Systems Science. And so all learning is integrated across all 3 pillars. The other couple distinct features about our school is that we were really built on kind of the foundational principles of equity, inclusion, and diversity, which means that it is fully baked into the fabric of the school. We also are teaching anatomy in somewhat of a future-facing, forward-thinking way. We are not using, the students will not be or have not been dissecting cadavers, but instead we're leveraging technology so that, anatomy is being taught by way of augmented and virtual reality. And then I'll just close by saying that our school has curricularized well-being. So we have a pretty significant and robust well-being curriculum. It's called REACH, which stands for Reflection, Education, Assessment, Coaching, and Health and Well-being. So every medical student is actually paired with a physician coach who is helping them along their journey in terms of developing their professional identity. So a couple distinct areas.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Our school a little bit different.
So I was, in preparing for the call, I saw the 3 pillars. I also saw that there are four threads kind of woven throughout the curriculum. And according to the website, they were equity, inclusion, and diversity, health promotion, which I assume is at least partially the coach program that you just mentioned, interprofessional collaboration, and leadership. Can you kind of unpack that? And I know you said that the three pillars are throughout the 4 years. How do the threads and the pillars come together?
That's
especially in an integrated curriculum.
I think that's right. And to your point, what we have done, and they really are threads, meaning that it is threaded across all 4 years. It's also threaded across our three pillars that we've just described. So the equity, inclusion, and diversity thread, for example, that's sort of where students come together in somewhat of a didactic seminar style space, and they really unpack issues of racism. So it's sort of where a lot of our anti-racism work happens. It's also where students think critically about biases and mitigating biases. In terms of advocacy and leadership, much of that is threaded through the health system science pillar or department, again, where students really learn and unpack the structural and social determinants of health. And then health promotion, as you've discussed, some of that is woven into the REACH curriculum, but in fact, we also have sort of these seminar or sort of more didactic sessions where students think about how we engage with communities. And I'm going to use COVID-19 as an example as we talk about vaccinations, for example, and how one would engage a community and patients in that way. And then the interpersonal, interprofessional collaboration pillar, we are partnering with Western School of Nursing and also USC's School of Pharmacy. So there's a lot happening. And again, it's sort of all moving parts throughout the entirety of the 4 years that our students are with us.
Kaiser Permanente, the organization, the healthcare system has a tremendous focus on prevention, healthcare maintenance, health maintenance. And I think takes a systems approach to it. Is that part of the health systems science, or?
It really is. It really is, in fact, where our students are really thinking critically about root causes, right, of disease. It's where students learn that there are any number of environmental factors, of structural factors that do play a role, right, in whether patients and communities are able to remain well. So to your point, it has been wonderful, being a school that is part of this larger organization that really has led the way and has been thinking about these issues for quite some time.
Right. Now, as obviously Kaiser has taken a distinctive approach to medical education. What about the admissions process? What's distinctive about the admissions process?
Yeah, so we've also engaged in admissions in ways that are intentional. So again, I started by saying that equity, inclusion, and diversity are kind of foundational to the school, and that is exactly the lens through which we've developed our admissions process. So we are holistic, and I know that's a word we hear frequently across the board, but
and it has multiple meanings to different people.
It has multiple meanings to multiple people.
That's
but
right.
We, in fact, every student who applies to our school really does have a chance, right? So we ensure that we've structured the system or the process so that we are really broadening the lens through which we see every single student who applies to the school. So we take into account their lived experiences, of which we know there are many, they're varied. We take into account any number of other attributes. And then, of course, we do balance all of that against their academic metrics, namely GPA and MCAT. And when we think about a holistic process, what that should mean to applicants is that we are not setting minimum GPAs, minimum MCAT scores. We are not having a computer system that sort of does the filtering for us, right? we are laying eyes on every single file that gets to us. And so there are any number of factors, right, that will play a role into whether a student, we are thinking more about students who are mission aligned.
Okay. And so I noted in MSAR on your site, I don't remember which one
Right.
at the moment, that you were in 2020 received over 10,000 applications. I'm going to guess that in this application cycle, that number was significantly higher.
Right.
So you read, or somebody reads and looks at every single one, primary and secondary?
We actually do. So just to unpack that piece a little bit, you are
Okay.
correct. In order to seat our 50 students, we did
That's
get over
right.
10,000 applications.
That's
And yeah, it's quite a heavy lift. And I will
Mhm.
say we have a lot of file readers, file reviewers.
Okay.
Now, the over 10,000, that's the primary MCAS application. About 80 to 85% of those students will fill out a secondary application, which is a school-specific application. So the number dwindles down a little bit. So ultimately, think about 8,500 students did, in fact, complete the secondary application for the school. And yes, we are reading files on a daily basis. We are distributing files to our various file reviewers, and every file gets looked at and gets screened. It is a lot of work. It is quite a bit of human resources that are required to do so, but we are fully committed to doing that.
All right. And what do you hope to learn in the secondary that you don't learn from the primary?
The primary application kind of introduces us, right, to the students. What the secondary application allows us to do is really look critically for mission alignment. And for that reason, every school's secondary application is a little bit different because
Right.
it is really structured alongside the specific mission of that school. So that's where we are really able to get a sense of whether this is a student who knows anything about the school. We are, though, also able to discern whether the student seems to be aligned with what we have to offer here at the school.
Many times I hear from applicants, I read the school's mission statement and they
Yeah,
all seem the same.
yeah. I think that's right. And one of the when I go out to do recruitment and I meet with prospective applicants and students, I do encourage them, in addition to reading the mission statement, kind of combing through the entirety of the website. Because to your point, I mean, I think there are many words that are going to look quite similar in
Right.
every school's mission statement. The other piece, though, that I do encourage students to do is I often refer to admissions offices as an underutilized resource. I always encourage our students with whom I engage to really connect with admissions counselors. And if there are even admissions deans, right, we are always available to meet with prospective applicants. And if there are any specific questions that folks are really interested in learning a little bit more about, then I think that's where those deeper conversations can be had. I often will have students send me emails saying, hey, I see that equity, inclusion, and diversity are part of your mission statement. What exactly does that mean? So reaching out is also something I do encourage prospective applicants to do.
Well, one question that you mentioned equity, inclusion, and diversity. Most people talk about it as diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm
Right.
sure there's a reason for the distinction. So,
Right.
would you mind sharing?
Yeah, and when I arrived, it was EID, equity, inclusion, diversity. At
Yeah.
my former institution, it was equity, diversity, and inclusion. But the one area I will focus on in that sort of alphabet soup of three letters is the equity piece. And the equity piece is so important. And I feel that it's been the most overlooked piece of diversity and inclusion. I mean, there was a time whereby we talked only about diversity and then we added inclusion. And so people flip those letters, ID or DI. But the equity piece was really missing for a long, long time. And when one looks at what equity really suggests, it's sort of the recognition that everyone has to start in life at a different place, right? And just ensuring that we are making the appropriate adjustments for that. So that's how I don't know that the ID or the DI in terms of how one flips them is as important as sort of the equity piece, at least as we see it as a school.
Of course, equity sometimes has as many interpretations as holistic review, but that's a different
It
question.
does.
That's a
It
different
does.
topic for a different conversation, I
It
think.
does. It absolutely does.
Right. What can applicants to Kaiser Permanente who are invited to interview, which again, going back to the first class's number was about 718 people,
Right.
what can they expect?
So we're planning on interviewing roughly the same amount this cycle. Now, last cycle, we pivoted to virtual
Right.
interviews because of the pandemic. And, with all of the uncertainty and the unknowns, although things are looking much brighter, I suppose, we have decided to continue on with a virtual process. So we remained committed to a hybrid model. What that means is that the students will engage in both a multiple mini interview as well as a traditional interview. So the one thing we changed about, when we had to pivot from in person to virtual is we did decrease the number of stations because again, it's all virtual. So we've had to make a few adjustments to ensure that we're thinking about Zoom fatigue and also thinking about ways of streamlining a process. We've learned a lot from last cycle having been virtual, and we also learned that we were able to successfully complete it. And so we're planning on doing it quite similarly to how we ran it last cycle.
Do you anticipate at some point returning to in-person interviews or offering the option of in-person interviews? I can understand this year you're just doing virtual, right?
Right.
This upcoming cycle.
Right.
But if we finally believe that that COVID is under control, would you see yourself going back to in-person or not?
Yeah, that is the plan.
Okay.
We have a brand new building. We have multiple mini interview suites that we built specifically for admissions interviews. And we are really eager to use them. And we are eager to bring our candidates back in person. There is no replacement for that. There were benefits to virtual engagement, I think one of which was, decreasing the cost for students in terms of traveling out to schools and staying in hotels, etc. But yeah, I think our plan, if things progress and continue on in the ways that they have been, the plan really is to return to an in-person interview process in 2022. The other thing I'll add is that we had to conduct Second Look weekend virtually as well this past spring, and again, we are hopeful that we can conduct that Second Look event in person in 2022 as well.
Okay. One applicant told us that you actually had over 20,000 applications this past cycle. Is that correct?
That is not correct. We didn't
good.
double. We increased by about 11%. So we had almost 12,000. Yeah.
Okay.
So
all right. So the two, they got the two right, but it's in the wrong place.
It's in the wrong place. It was almost 12,000, not
all
quite
right.
20,000. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good to have that correct.
Yeah.
Even so, as I said, you got 10,478 applications, at least in the primary. You say about 8,500 ended up completing the secondary. You then interviewed 718, so that's less than 10%.
Yes.
And you matriculated 50, which is again less than 10%.
Correct.
How on earth do you winnow it down?
It's difficult, right? And I'll just say that and this is something I say to every student with whom I engage who plans on applying to us or to any medical school. I would argue that any student who gets an interview really has an opportunity. So I always say to students, think about the application process as kind of a marathon, almost an ultra marathon.
It is.
Because at every step, you're just trying to get to the next step. And what I mean by that is you're trying to get a secondary application. You're trying to get an interview. And I think of the interview really as where the door opens up. And because our interviews are also structured with mission alignment in mind, a lot of how students present themselves to us, right? How much do you know about the school? Are we just sort of, another school on your list? Is the message that we get from you that you really, really want to be part of the school and part of the community? And it's really interesting that we can often tell just based on engaging with students, the students who are really, really interested in the school, right? And really appear to have mission aligned goals and values. Now, having said all that, and every school and every, there are 155 schools in accredited schools in the country, MD granting schools. And what I will say to that is we are all also cognizant that there's talent tenfold over every single year. We know that 40% of all applicants get into med school,
Right.
but the 60% who don't, there's a lot of talent there too.
Oh, yeah.
So I say all of that.
Of course, many of them get in the following year, which proves the
Exactly,
point.
to be encouraging,
Yeah.
right? And to say to applicants, if you didn't make it the first year, don't be discouraged. Try again. And I've seen so many success stories upon the second try or the third try. So it requires our students to really reflect and dig deep and think about how important it is for them, right, ultimately to become physicians, because it's a difficult journey, and it's easy to get discouraged, but my message is don't be discouraged. Try again.
Accepted works with all kinds of graduate school applicants, not just medical school applicants.
Right.
And there's no doubt in my mind that the medical school application process is the most demanding.
I think so.
Yeah. There's no comparison. There's
I don't
absolutely no
think there's
comparison.
anything that compares. My daughter just graduated law school, and I remembered her
It's a
application.
piece of cake. It was a piece of cake.
Compared by comparison,
Yeah.
in terms of the application process,
Right,
quite
right.
different. I agree.
Right.
I agree.
Now, Kaiser, I know you've focused very much on mission alignment, and that's a major focus of yours. But I would suspect that you have a little bit of an additional, you want to call it impediment or attraction in that regard, because you offer such generous terms. It's tuition free for the first 5 classes. I mean, the first 5 graduating classes with a stipend.
Correct.
So, do you think that makes it harder for you to discern that mission alignment?
I think you make an excellent point. I think what it allows us to do is really think critically as we're reading through applications, and even in the way we've designed our interview questions to sort of try to be discerning in that way, because I think you make a great point. I am like every other school that offers, tuition, remission, and stipends. I do think it definitely is something that, it is in the back of our minds when we're engaging with applicants and ensuring that folks are really interested in the school for what the school offers and not just the tuition remission. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with also taking that into account. Medical education is expensive. The whole debt reporting was just released by the AAMC a few days ago, and it's pretty astonishing the kind of debt medical students graduate with. So I think that every med student, most med students would factor that into their decision making. So I think that is okay. But as we see it, we want folks who, yes, that's been factored in, but there are other aspects of the school, the curriculum, the mission that is equally attractive to them.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. Does Kaiser Permanente have any plans to either waive the MCAT or go test optional?
We talked about that extensively last cycle, especially as there were cancellations by the WMC, and they did a great job in terms of catching up so that many, if not most applicants were in fact able to take the MCAT at least once. And one area that we discussed extensively was what that would do in terms of, again, when we're looking at candidates holistically. And what I mean by that is, as we're looking at other metrics that is part of the holistic review system, that's sort of the third area that we assess, it would almost mean that students would almost have very little wiggle room in other areas. It would almost demand that students be exceptional in every single area. And when we think about equity, and I know this is sort of a hot debate topic, we weren't completely convinced that waiving the MCAT or going MCAT optional at this point would have been entirely helpful to students in the ways in which we're thinking about our evaluation and assessment of students. But it's an ongoing conversation. We've seen what's happened with the SAT across the country, certainly many of the California schools. It'll be interesting to see whether that sort of filters up into MCAT, and there are all kinds of interesting things happening with exams. So I think the jury is out. For this cycle, we are still requiring that students take the MCAT.
You can always choose to essentially waive it if you feel it's appropriate.
That's exactly right. And it's certainly, we continue to study what is happening nationally with the MCAT. The WMC has their MCAT validity research group going. So we're always sort of looking at their outcomes and what different MCAT scores mean, et cetera.
Right. Mm-hmm. Business school, there's a growing trend to waive either the GMAT or the GRE. There's go test, to either to issue waivers or to go test optional. So the thing about waivers is it basically goes to the applicant who can show academic ability in other ways. So it's, if you don't need the test to admit them, then they waive it. That's fine. But
and how is that really beneficial, and if so, to whom? Right.
Exactly. So, yeah. It's a kind of interesting thing. One of the things I know drives applicants nuts. It's not so much this time of year. It's more like the fall.
Right.
Silence. They don't hear anything. Nothing. Crickets. Nothing.
Right.
How do you view letters of intent or correspondence from applicants for whom the sounds is driving them nuts, or who have interviewed, or who are waitlisted? I assume you have a wait list.
We do have a wait list. We have this past year, as we did the first year, had a very robust wait list, and the silence is tough from an applicant's perspective. And
by the way, I love the timeline you have on your website.
Yeah, we've tried to at least remain semi-engaged in that way. One area that we're toying with for this cycle is just to send sort of these updates. I mean, even if we're saying, by the way, you're still under review, or XYZ, that we are very cognizant that the silence can be done to applicants. And we have wonderful admissions counselors. They try to remain engaged when candidates engage with them. One of the things we started this past year, we are now doing weekly office hours. And so it's interesting in that we often will have folks who are in the pool who will come to office hours to say, what's going on with my application? So, but we do try to remain engaged as much as possible. When candidates send us letters of intent, or letters suggesting interest in the school, we do just attach that to the file, and it actually ends up being helpful, especially if those are the same candidates that are on the wait list, because as we're sifting through, we're often looking, again, always keeping in mind mission alignment, et cetera. But we also want folks who really are saying, we want to be at your school.
Sure. I would assume updates, relevant updates, not trivial updates, meaningful updates.
Exactly right.
All right. How does Kaiser view applicants who have dealt with emotional illness?
We, as I shared earlier, our school has a pretty significant focus on well-being. So in fact, when candidates write about these issues on their application, we read them with, I think, through the lens of developing a deeper understanding of the candidate, but also getting a sense of how they've sort of approached that that particular challenge, and what they've learned about themselves in that process. So it is in no way used negatively against candidates. We actually embrace that, and there's something about that level of transparency and vulnerability that for us is a definite plus. And not only do applicants write about it, but often when they come out to interview, they'll talk about these issues.
Mhm.
And again, I think for us and the kind of school that we are, displaying that level of vulnerability is always going to be a positive thing.
All right. And how does Kaiser view applicants, a different area entirely? How does Kaiser view applicants who have an academic infraction or perhaps a criminal issue on their record?
Right. So there are two things that can show up on the application. One is kind of the institutional action.
Right.
Again, when we're reading through those, now there are schools, as you may know, who filter all those out. We don't. We look at them, we read them, and what we're really trying to understand from the applicant is A, what happened, B, was there accountability, and
Yes.
C, what did you learn as a result of? So that's the context in which we're reading that. In terms of things like felonies, etc., I think much of it is going to depend on what is on there. But we read through those. There's no, filtering out people who've had this done. As I think many applicants are aware that part of most schools post admissions, or actually as they get admitted to schools, many of the post admissions requirements is in fact a background check. So it is nice if there's something on the application and that it matches what may be on the background check. I think the issue that could arise is there a significant discrepancy, right? Because again, it really comes back to just transparency and truthfulness on the part of the applicant. But we are a school that I would like to believe grants a lot of grace.
Okay.
So,
Would distance and time from the academic the infraction or action, or from the criminal event, the conviction, if it was a conviction, would that play a role?
Absolutely. And that's such a great question, because that's often part of the journey. And we sometimes will see this in non-traditional students, students who've been away from an academic setting or environment for a decade or 8 years, and they actually may write about this, and it ends up being just part of the journey, often part of what informed their decision to pursue medicine in the first place. So that absolutely matters.
Okay. What advice would you have for applicants interested in applying to Kaiser Permanente in this 2021-2022 application cycle? I mean, it's now mid-June.
Right.
Your show is going to air, I think, the very end of June, it's the beginning of July, actually, right after July 4th.
Right.
Are they late? Is it too late for them?
Great question. So I always encourage to apply early. You're not yet late. We will get applications. The cycle opened up on May 27th. We will get applications on June 25th. File reviews will begin, as you pointed out, sometime in early July. And they're not late. I do encourage applicants, though, to get those primary applications out by no later than the end of July. Obviously, some will be a little bit later. And the main reason for that is there is sort of this 4 to 6 weeks verification process that AAMC has to go through. And so I point out to applicants that until that is completed, you wouldn't yet be ready to get your secondary application. So, every week past the last week of July will take you further along in the application cycle. The other important thing is we talk a lot about how competitive medical school is. And I do try to also highlight for applicants that part of the reason it is so competitive, A, is there aren't on a relative scale, right, enough slots for all the talent, all the talented folks who apply to medical school. But the other big issue is schools run out of interview slots. So even if you are an amazing candidate in every single way, if you've applied, if your primary goes out in September, chances are you're not getting a completed application until sometime in maybe mid to late October. So you're already taking yourself sort of out of that running for that cycle, not because you're not amazing, but because the interview slots are filling up.
100%. Thank you. It's a great answer.
Absolutely.
What about those planning to apply in future years? In other words, they're not planning to apply this cycle. They're planning to apply for the 2023 matriculating class, or even the 2024 matriculating class. What should they be doing?
A couple things I always highlight. One is ensure that you're meeting with your pre-health advisors at your home institutions, or your mentors if you are someone who has been out of school for a while. And part of meeting with your pre-health advisors and mentors is ensuring that you are kind of getting yourself ready for med school. And part of knowing when to apply is sort of having that overall readiness for that. The other thing I would encourage students to do is try to attend as many pre-health events as you can. AAMC has now kind of pivoted to about 2 big virtual fairs every year. It tends to have a ton of schools across the country who are fully engaged in those. So that's going to be important. The other piece is, try to really begin to think about what doctoring means to you, and kind of creating kind of your own list of values. And, with that, beginning to look through the MSAR and just sort of perusing schools. You have a few years to do so. Try to engage in office hours at different schools. If there are, I'll just pitch hours. If you're interested in our school, we do have weekly Wednesday office hours. So get into those virtual spaces where there are counselors and other folks who will actually have sound advice, right? I don't know how popular my next comment would be, but stay out of studentdoctor.net. Try to really get a lot of your more data-driven questions answered through the AAMC or directly through, different admissions offices. So that would be kind of my sort of advice, both for folks who are soon going to apply, but also those who may be a couple years out from applying.
Speaking of studentdoctor.net, I was in that forum a couple of weeks ago, and there was a hot and heavy discussion about shadowing.
Okay, got it.
Okay, and there were 2 topics. One was, is it required that pre-meds have shadowing before they be accepted? And what about virtual shadowing? Is that acceptable? So how would, again, and it was being very hotly debated.
Yeah, and so that, shadowing is almost, and I say this very cautiously, it's almost falling by the wayside for a number of reasons. One is that many physicians have just gotten so busy, especially, it's almost as if the world has changed in the last year.
It has.
Right. So the whole shadowing in person was almost a thing of the past during the pandemic. And it's only now that students are perhaps being, reintroduced and allowed to enter into the clinical spaces with physicians. The other thing, though, and this preceded the pandemic, that a lot of us in the admissions community, it's a conversation we've been having, is how much information do we get about a student because they've shadowed a doctor, and how beneficial has shadowing been to any individual student? And I think it's variable. I think there are students who've had more active engagement during shadowing, and then there are those who just literally shadow. And one of the experiences that I've encouraged students to engage in more than shadowing or alongside shadowing is scribing. And I think that's a much more active way of getting a sense of what doctors really do. You get a sense of kind of terminology, and you get the opportunity to really observe that doctor-patient interaction in ways that you are almost fully engaged in. So there's nothing particularly wrong with shadowing, but students may think that they're getting a sort of ton of brownie points because they've shadowed, and it's not necessarily viewed as robust an experience as perhaps it had been 5-7 years ago.
Right.
And because we've been in primarily a virtual world in the last year, a lot of students, in fact, have been doing kind of virtual scribing and those sorts of things.
All right. Thank you. That's a great answer.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it was very interesting, that particular discussion. What would you have liked me to ask you?
So I guess how we've done this year in
Go
light
for,
of the pandemic.
absolutely go for it. That's kind of basic.
So it's been
A little
fun.
embarrassed here.
I
Okay.
will say that we were, I think, frankly, given all of the sort of challenges with COVID-19, et cetera, I feel that we were able to pivot pretty seamlessly because of how our curriculum is structured. Times when we've had to either have hybrid engagement or all virtual engagement. So we did quite well. We had 2 unrelated COVID-19 positive folks at the school, and no one else became positive. And again, we do not think there was any connection in those 2 cases. And we ended up going virtual after the holidays in light of the cases rising in LA County.
Right. Sure.
We resumed, I believe it was March, resumed in person. We did learn that though we can do it virtual, using a virtual platform, in person is a lot more effectual. Though we're all masked and distanced, though it's, that's changing over time, we have still remained masked in spite of June 15th being a couple days ago in California opening up. But we learned that. We learned that we really enjoy being in person more than virtual. We were able to get instruction done. We were able to do it without skipping a beat. But even the students endorsed preferring to be in person. So we have a wonderful team. We have a wonderful group who are sort of behind us constantly, keeping the spaces sanitized. Our students have been quite wonderful in terms of keeping their masks on, remaining distanced in the classrooms. Because we only had 50 students this year, we were able to utilize just about every room in the school. So we do have enough space because we're in fact built out to house, right, about 200 students. So it's been good. It's all in all, it's been good. It's been as challenging as you can imagine, building the plane and flying it all at the same time in the midst of a global pandemic. But it's been an amazing year. Our students will be finished on July 2nd. And we will.
You'll have M2s. You'll have M2s by the time this show airs.
M2s in mid-July. So getting all ready for that. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Are there, since you brought up I'm embarrassed I didn't ask the question.
Oh, no worries.
But are there any adaptations to COVID that you think you're going to keep around?
So I do believe that, we're again still in flux with this whole thing. We're still wondering, I think we're going to be able to do away with distancing. I suspect we're going to have to remain masked for a little bit longer. I mean, one of the areas we're critically looking at is, who's vaccinated. I mean, that's really a choice, but and for that reason, I think we'll remain masked. That's one of the areas that we are currently in conversations about. So
now, one of the things I remember from last year is that there's a significant and early clinical exposure. Were your students able to maintain that clinical? I could say they had to be vaccinated.
They were, and right,
Yeah.
and they had to be vaccinated. So again, we did have a little bit of a break from the students going out to their longitudinal integrated clerkships after the holiday. They were able to engage in March, and so that definitely had, we had to sort of that was cut for a little bit. And the other area that we did have a few challenges with in light of the pandemic were the service learning opportunities. And so I know that our service learning leads and others are, exploring other options here and there. But even that has gone quite well.
Great.
Mhm.
Dr. Willies-Jacobo, thank you so much for your answers and your questions, because your question was very good. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed learning about Kaiser Permanente School of Medicine. Now that it's a reality and not just a hypothetical, it's a still new program, but it's fascinating. I'm sure that you've piqued listeners' interest. Where can they learn more about the Kaiser Permanente Tyson Medical School?
Great. Thank you so much also for having me, Linda. So students can learn more about us at medschool.kp.org. And I think our website is organized in ways that they can sort of navigate any number of pillars and departments and that sort of thing. So we definitely welcome, that level of engagement. And it was wonderful being with you again, Linda. Thank you so much for having me.
You're most welcome. Most welcome. And thank you again for coming. Listener, you'll find links to the Kaiser Permanente School of Medicine, as well as related resources and podcasts, including the previous interview with Dr. Willies-Jacobo, in the show notes at accepted.com/424. Quick reminder, don't miss How to Create Successful Secondary Applications, the free webinar taking place on July 8th at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. I'll be delivering that webinar. Save your spot at accepted.com/424 webinar. Listener, thank you too for tuning in to this, our 424th episode. If you found this show helpful, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcatcher you prefer. So you don't miss anything, subscribe. You can find subscribe links at, again, accepted.com/424. This is Admission Straight Talk, produced by Accepted, and I'm your host, Linda Abraham. I'll talk to you again next week.